Good afternoon and welcome to St. Matthew's for this lecture with Dr. Sidney Nathans. So fortunate to have Dr. Nathans here. I've been telling people that I want to capture him and not let him go. But I think we'll have to just savor what we have this afternoon. I understand many of you are from Duke or the Duke environs, but this is strictly a nonpartisan place. And we ask you not to gloat about any recent sporting events that may have occurred. Amen. I'm just really utterly delighted to have a second opportunity to have time with Dr. Nathans, and I know you are as well, to be here this afternoon. To introduce him more fully, I'd like to invite one of his former students, Mary Rocap, to come forward.
One of the least of his former students, just to be clear, but I do claim that. Okay. I also wanted to make sure we have a modest reception following this talk, so it's in the building right to you walk down the steps to the left. But it might be more opportunity to share with Dr. Nathans, and also maybe you have some books to sign, for him to sign. In the spring of 1970, I was a freshman in a history class on Duke's East Campus. Dr. Sidney Nathans was my professor. I sat in his class hoping to draw no attention to myself, to be silent and invisible. Had I known Sidney then, as I have come to know him now, through these months of email back and forths, I should not have worried so. He is kind, considerate, thoughtful, curious, generous. These qualities have stood him quite well in his work as a historian and author. The descendants of Mary Walker's benefactors, Peter and Susan Leslie, found in him someone who was both interested in their family stories as well as worthy of their trust. The result of his research, the award-winning To Free a Family, The Journey of Mary Walker, is the first book of a trilogy. It was published in 2012. The second, A Mind to Stay, White Plantation, Black Homeland, was published in 2017 and focuses on the Cameron Plantation in Alabama and those enslaved sent to work the land. The final book is coming out any second now, true, and is called Freedom's Mirage. The story of St. Matthew's is intertwined with that of Mary Walker. The founders of our church were members of the planter class. They represented some of the largest land holdings of the state: Farintosh, Hardscrabble, Somerset Place. There are 22 Camerons buried in our churchyard, 9 Cains and 13 Collinses. Their sense of entitlement over those they enslaved is shocking in its scope. Hear these words written in Duncan Cameron's will, leaving Mary Walker's family and all their increase forever to his 2 daughters. Mary Walker didn't want to belong to anyone. She wanted to be free. She wanted her children to be free. She wanted her grand and great-grandchildren to be free. Lest we think this a long time ago, consider this. My great-grandmother, who I knew well as a child, was born the year the Civil War ended, 1865. I, at least, still live in that imaginable stretch of time. Those planters did plant something, and what they planted and tended still grows, although altered in appearance. It is a growth that needs uprooting. The writing of Sidney Nathans helps expose the human story behind an awful injustice. Between them, those 3 planter families owned over 2,000 souls, children of God, not chattel. In this book is the story of one of them, a woman named Mary Walker. May her story help us who live, work, and worship on these common grounds. May we plant and tend a different kind of seed. May her story help us nurture beloved community. Please welcome with me author, scholar, humanitarian, Sidney Nathans.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Reverend Pruworth, Reverend Phillips, for inviting me here today and to be a part of the bicentennial observation of St. Matthew's. Two preliminaries. First, if I don't speak loud enough, something subtle like "speak up" will get my attention. Secondly, old professors do fade away, but until then, there is always a handout. This is a handout of some illustrations. The first page will be the handout for much of the talk, and I'll let you know toward the end of the talk when to turn the page and go to the second page. So To Free a Family is the story of Mary Walker, an enslaved woman who grew up just 18 miles from where we are today. She was legally the property of the Cameron family, whose members and descendants have been part of St. Matthew's for 2 centuries. Born in bondage in 1818 on the Cameron plantation just north of Durham, Mary Walker escaped slavery in 1848, but she had to leave her mother and her children behind. She spent the next 17 years of her life trying to rescue them without giving herself or her friends or her location away. Mary Walker's story reveals much about the world of whites and blacks, enslaved and free, who lived 2 centuries ago. It was a single letter that drew me into Mary Walker's world. And I want to talk about how I came upon that letter and how it spoke to me and of discoveries that followed, as for 20 years I pursued the saga behind it. And what emerged were 2 stories, entwined and inseparable, a tale of abiding family love and an intimate account of the black and white struggle for emancipation before the Civil War. I'd never heard of Mary Walker or her story until I came across a letter published in a book by Herbert Gutman called The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom. That's the cover, and that's the first page of the letter. The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom was one of 2 landmark books that came out in 1976 about the impact of slavery on the black family. The other book was Roots by Alex Haley, which I believe some of you will remember. And both authors challenged the view that prevailed a half-century ago that slavery had undermined the possibility of family ties among enslaved African Americans and for generations afterwards. And that presumption seemed logical. In bondage, women and men, parents and children faced the likelihood, and some the certainty, that at some point their family ties would be broken by sale, by separation, or by sexual abuse. Whose heart would be hardened by such a system? In the words of one enslaved woman, "Why does the slave ever love?" Alex Haley used oral history and his family story to challenge that presumption. Herbert Gutman, the historian, found his evidence in the archives, just like I do, in the records of slaveholders themselves. Every year, planters made lists of their enslaved people. Those were lists of names for accounting purposes. Ingeniously, Gutman used those yearly lists to decode the naming practices of enslaved people. And he found that African Americans consistently gave family names of parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, to their children and to their grandchildren. So though indirect, that testimony powerfully suggested that despite the breakups built into bondage, African Americans were attached to family members and wanted their children to recall and pass on their names and their memories. but was there direct testimony written at the time of slavery which could corroborate that love of family? In the papers of Mary Walker's North Carolina slaveholders, the papers of the Cameron family, Herbert Gutman found Exhibit A+. And that was the letter that he published in The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, and that was the document that got me started on this project. So the letter was written in 1859 by a man who identified himself as J.P. Leslie, a professor of mining at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was written to one of North Carolina's wealthiest women, and Mary Walker's former owner, Mildred Cameron. I want to read for the letter. I have been lately touched to the heart with a case of heartbreaking distress, which you have it entirely in your power, I find, to cure. I have come to know one Mary Walker, formerly in your family, and I have seen how sick at heart she is about her mother and especially her two children. Her heart is slowly breaking. She thinks of nothing but her children and speaks of nothing else when she speaks of herself at all, which is very seldom. Her mother heart yearns unspeakably after them. She's saved a considerable sum of money to buy them, can command more from friends, and will sacrifice anything to see them once again and have their young lives renew the freshness of her own weary spirit. It is in this behalf that I address you, to realize this hope of hers. Well, over the course of the years, I can't tell you how many thousands of letters I read, but none, not one, ever moved me or possessed me as much as this letter about a woman who had escaped slavery, left her family behind, and whose heart was slowly breaking. So I knew up front this was an unusual story. For one thing, most women did not flee slavery, for obvious reasons. Second, those who did tried to take their children with them or get them back as soon as they could. Consider the three most famous women to escape slavery. Harriet Tubman of Maryland fled alone, and then she returned to rescue her husband. When he said, "No, I'm staying," we would say he moved on. She brought out others, the first of 13 daring rescues of relatives and friends. Or take Sojourner Truth, the northern enslaved woman who took that name and became a legendary crusader against slavery. She also left bondage on her own, only to see her son sold in reprisal to Alabama. And she declared, "I will have my son." And through the courts, she got him back. Or there's Harriet Jacobs of Edenton, North Carolina. Pressed to be her owner's concubine, she escaped his clutches, but she hid in her grandmother's attic and remained there until her children were safely freed, a story recounted in her wonderful book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Well, Mary Walker's story was different from theirs. A protracted, agonizing, heartbreaking, total separation that lasted for years. And only in time did I begin to wonder, was her story that different? Only in time did I begin to think, weren't there others who left bondage, where liberation was intertwined with loss, release with remorse, freedom with fear for those who were left behind? For how many others did escape fall short of emancipation? But I have to say, I'm not that kind of historian. I don't start, how representative is this story? I didn't start with the question of how representative Mary Walker's story was. I started with my gut, and my gut said, you have to know more. So, in piecemeal fashion, I began to go after the story. The author of the 1859 letter, J.P. Leslie, had identified himself as a professor of mining at the University of Pennsylvania. So I got myself to the Free Library of Philadelphia, and like some scholarly Rocky Balboa, I bounded up the steps to the card catalog. That's right, this was the 1980s, before Google, before Wikipedia, before Ancestry.com. And I did find a card for the life and letters of Peter and Susan Leslie, 2 volumes, 941 pages, edited by the Leslie's daughter, Mary Leslie Ames. I got the volumes. Peter Leslie had started out as a Boston minister and then had become a renowned geologist. The books had more than a dozen tantalizing mentions of Mary Walker. Scholars axiom: an addition of letters always means there are more letters. Where were they? Long story short, I'm going to extend it a little bit. Actually, the wonderful Duke Library had a collection of telephone directories. And this collection of letters was published in St. Paul. So they had a St. Paul telephone directory, over the years. And I looked up Ames, and sure enough, there were Ames who lived in St. Paul. So I wrote to the name that I found in the telephone directory, and about 6 months later, I heard back, yes, there were more letters, but they were upstairs in the attic trunk, and until the last of descendants of the Ames died, they were going to stay there. Okay. So the Leslie's daughter married in 1883, moved to St. Paul. That's where Mary Leslie Ames had gathered and selectively edited and published the letters of her parents in 1909. Well, in 1991, the entire collection moved again, this time to Boulder, Colorado, to the extraordinary care and organizing mission of descendant Mary Leslie Wolfe and her husband Ed and her daughter Linda. And a letter to Mary Wolfe brought an invitation to come to Boulder and use the papers, fresh out of attic trunks, thousands of letters and diaries and journals. Fresh out of attic trunks. That kind of one-man gold strike does not happen to many historians, but it really happened to me. The time in Boulder was a historian's heaven. Over the course of a week of 18-hour days in the papers, a huge backstory to that 1859 letter began to emerge. Well, I think the first question that I had, and that you may have, is how and why Mary Walker escaped. And how seems undramatic, but only from the outside. Mary Walker was in Philadelphia, looking after Mildred Cameron, the invalid daughter of her owner, Duncan Cameron. Father and daughter were there for medical care. In August 1848, on the eve of their return to North Carolina, Mary Walker silently disappeared into the city. No baying dogs, no slave catchers hot on her trail. She simply stole away, actually walking right past Independence Hall. But when you consider what that decision meant, abandoning her family without a word, becoming a refugee, having to make her way in a large northern city, one can imagine the inner turbulence. So why escape? Well, the answer came from one of Mary Walker's Philadelphia friends, who reported that there had been a vocal disagreement between Mary Walker and her owner. Vocal disagreement is a euphemism, of course. When you and I disagreed vocally with a parent, it was called backtalk, and we got smacked or sent to our room or both. I see some parents smiling here. When an enslaved person questioned an owner, backtalk was seen as something else, impudence, and the penalty for impudence was severe, whipping or banishment or both. The friend didn't say what prompted the conflict, just that it was severe enough that Duncan Cameron threatened to send Mary Walker away to a plantation that he opened in the Deep South. So one way or another, her family was going to be lost to her. Mary Walker escaped not once, but twice. From first in Philadelphia in 1848, and again in Boston, to Boston where she fled in 1850, where she was given refuge by a young white couple. The young white couple is at the bottom of that handout. But there was a puzzle there. Those two people who decided to help her, Peter Leslie and his wife Susan, were not abolitionists. They were not activists in the struggle to abolish slavery, at least not until Mary Walker came into their lives as a refugee from bondage in November 1850. So why did they give her sanctuary? Well, like many Northerners in 1850, Peter Leslie and Susan Leslie opposed slavery morally, but shied from the abolitionist who attacked slavery and slaveholders vitriolically. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 changed all that. In September 1850, the Congress passed, the President signed the Fugitive Slave Law, and it required that Northerners assist the capture of anyone who fled bondage. It required that Northerners who didn't help, who harbored fugitives, or who obstructed their recapture could be fined up to $1,000 and sentenced to 6 months in jail. Peter Leslie and his wife Susan were horrified at what they called the Satanic Law, but they remained passive. They thought the very enormity of the thing would produce a speedy repeal. Then, in late October 1850, they got a letter from a cousin in Philadelphia. Would they take in a fugitive slave? Peter Leslie was still a minister in 1850, not yet a geologist. I found a sermon that Peter Leslie preached to his Boston congregation on the last Sunday of October, 1850. He didn't tell what Susan and he had been asked to do, but the sermon revealed the answer. From the pulpit, he asked, would Christ return fugitive slaves? Imagine the Savior saying in reply, I cannot help you, friend. It's a hard case. I pity you from my heart, but I dare not conceal you or help you conceal yourself. Sure, I shall be fined thousands of dollars and probably be put in jail if I do. We can only wait and try to repeal the law next winter. Next winter? Lord, the hunter is at my heels. There is no judge to appeal to, no jury to listen to my case. Lord, protect me, Lord. Imagine the Savior still replying, I cannot, friend. It's against the law. Peter Leslie broke free from the parable. Give this law of Congress to the winds. Harbor and protect the oppressed wherever you find him. The Leslies took Mary Walker in for what they thought might only be a matter of weeks. Little did they realize that she and the cause of her family would become part of their lives and the lives of friends and relatives for years to come. For them, as for many Northerners, her presence brought slavery home. She sewed, she prayed, she spoke beautiful English, she could read and write. She was so fair-skinned as to seem almost white, and yet she and her children were, by the law of the land, slaves. When Mary Walker first came to the Leslies in 1850, she seemed resigned to the fate of her children. And that was a mystery too. Recall the urgency and the poignancy of that 1859 letter. She thinks of nothing but her children. Her mother heart yearns unspeakably after them. So why the calm before the storm? And I learned that Mary Walker's enslaved forebears had been in the possession of their white owners for generations since the 1870s. Over 3 generations, they had emerged as the first family of house servants and skilled workers. Mary Walker's mother and then she herself had become, by the 1830s, seamstresses and companions for the plantation mistress and her daughters. There was good reason that she might hope that the long service of her family would protect her mother and her children from reprisal. And she was right. In the meantime, in the early 1850s, Mary Walker moved into the household of Susan Leslie's widowed and ailing mother in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and became her indispensable caregiver. Mother Ann Jean Lyman and her sister Catherine Robbins, in turn, took Mary Walker under wing, read aloud to her and to each other from books and newspapers, and gave her a sense of serenity and hope for self-improvement that she'd never felt in bondage. Well, all that changed early in 1853 with the death of the white slaveholding patriarch, 75-year-old Duncan Cameron. From that moment on, Mary Walker became a woman obsessed. In a letter to her husband, Peter, Susan Leslie recorded the change. Mary Walker became overcome with suffering and excitement, unable to rest day or night, possessed to save her children at all hazards. Her own easy position became as nothing to her, indeed increased her misery for those she loved. Mary Walker went to see the leading anti-slavery lawyer of Massachusetts and his wife, both of whom she knew well. She asked them to help her find an intermediary who would purchase her family with money she had saved and would raise from others. And they refused. They were entirely principled against putting money into the hands of slave owners. The lawyer's wife begged Mary Walker, "Give up your mother and children as if they were dead." Mary Walker kept her composure, but she was secretly indignant. If it were their daughter who was in slavery, would they give her up and form other ties? So Mary Walker turned to another friend who promised immediately, "Well, I'll write the family members who had inherited her enslaved children. Susan Leslie intervened. If the friend wrote, he would expose her location and expose her to recapture. Mary Walker's response, she had to do something. Why should she not run every risk rather than not save her children and her children's children, for so runs the will from the curse of slavery? Escape had not brought emancipation. Susan Leslie implored Mary Walker, "You must look out for yourself as well as your children." She took Mary Walker's hand, begged her to leave the whole subject in his care and his management to her husband Peter. Mary Walker was silent. The two women went to bed, neither slept. At midnight, when Susan Leslie became ill, Mary Walker came into her room to look after her. Susan Leslie wrote her husband. Her whole manner was changed to one point of patient, sad resignation. She told me she had passed 3 hours on her knees and reached a conclusion. She would be patient. She would leave it all to me. Well, in fact, over the next dozen years, Mary Walker and Susan and Peter Leslie each took a leading turn in trying to recover the Walker children. Peter Leslie hired a white carpenter and teamed up with the black leader of the Underground Railroad to orchestrate a covert attempt to rescue Mary Walker's family from Virginia. So the carpenter came to Boston, and he met with the head of the Underground Railroad in Boston, Lewis Hayden, and Mary Walker then met with him, and she gave him earrings and a ring to identify her. And then the carpenter was to go down to Raleigh and see if he could get to Mary Walker's mother and Mary Walker's children. And he found that he was stonewalled. That would be our turn when he got there. And the Leslie's thought, well, maybe he was just a fraud, just taking our money and doing that. But I think, in fact, Mary Walker's mother knew that she didn't have any real chance of getting out with those children. And in fact, if word got out that she was even in touch with somebody trying to help her escape, that she would be sold. And I think she was right about that. But that's all conjecture, but that's what we historians do. In any case, he came back and he had no good results. So in the meantime then, Susan Leslie sought help from abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass and famed author Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she wrote to both of them. And I actually tried to find out what happened to that letter to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and discovered that some of Harriet Beecher Stowe's is in the correspondence of Lord Elgin in England. So I wrote Lord Elgin, and he said he'd get back to me as soon as he could. I'm still waiting for that. And Mary Walker, for her part, went to school under Leslie's efforts. By mid-1856, she scripted her own plane. She contacted a Philadelphia friend who found a different rescue agent, and she sent him a box with items to prove that the agent was her representative. And she named enslaved friends in Raleigh who could help him when he got there. Uncle Zach belongs to the Presbyterian minister and is the sexton of the Baptist Church. I don't know how that works, but Willis Haywood is the waiter at the largest hotel, and he'll direct you to him. Otherwise, inquire for Glasgow, one of the colored deacons of the Baptist Church. Either he or Uncle Zach may be trusted. Well, as of the summer of 1859, nothing had worked. So when I pulled back from these details, the details of Mary Walker's strivings, and read other accounts, actually I realized that for many others who had escaped, freedom had come with dread for those who were left behind. And others too had sought black and white allies that they could trust. And others too had ventured camouflaged strategies to recover relatives from behind the Cotton Curtain. Mary Walker's experience did represent and mirror that of many. And the 4-page letter that started this long project, Peter Leslie's September 1859 letter on behalf of Mary Walker and her children, was one of many secret strivings to achieve emancipation one by one. What came of the letter? There was no answer. Perhaps in time, there might have been. But 6 weeks after Peter Leslie wrote to Mildred Cameron, an event occurred that brought an end to the era of individual ransoms, rescues, and appeals. On October 16, 1859, John Brown raided the federal armory at Harper's Ferry with the goal of launching and arming a slave rebellion. Captured and tried, Brown was sentenced to hang. As it happened, and this is one of the many unbelievable coincidences in this story, as it happened, Peter and Susan Leslie were summoned to comfort John Brown's wife, Mary Brown, as she waited in Philadelphia for the December 1859 execution of her husband. Susan Leslie wrote to Mary Walker about their encounter. "It is rare," Susan Leslie wrote, "to disapprove so entirely of a man's deed, and yet has such entire sympathy with his motives and his character." Well, John Brown achieved his ultimate vision. Redemption from bondage would come, not one at a time, but for all at once, and by bloodbath. A bloodbath. But whose blood? Mary Walker herself had to decide that question once the Civil War came. The moment of decision for her came on the 1st of January, 1863. The announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation was expected sometime that day. Mary Walker was at the expectant gathering of blacks and whites at Boston's Tremont Temple, among the hundreds in the audience that waited through the day and into the night, waiting and hoping for word confirming the proclamation, listening to 3 rallying speeches from Frederick Douglass and more from other abolitionist leaders. Finally, at 11 p.m., the telegram came. Hats and bonnets flew into the air. People wept openly. And Frederick Douglass spoke for all. "We join in the shout for the freed and in the anthem of the redeemed." The next morning, this was the journal entry of Mary Walker's close friend and longtime confidant, Catherine Robbins. "When I have read in history long ago of wars and revolutions, battles and bloodshed, they filled me with horror. I felt that life would be of no value in the midst of such events. I felt that we were far removed from them, that they would never come to us. But now, all the fearful scenes of which we have read are enacted in our own country upon a larger scale than was ever known." When Catherine Robbins talked to Mary Walker about the meeting of January 1st, however, she was startled, because when Mary Walker came home from that meeting, the mother who had tried for 15 years to seek and get the safety of her children declared she was now prepared to have her children suffer and die, that all might be free. When Mary Walker saw the look of disbelief on the face of her friend, she repeated, she wished her children to know how to die for their freedom. If she heard they were dead in the cause, she would say, "Amen. It is best so." Endless frustration, unending reports of war, and finally the promise of the proclamation had steeled Mary Walker, and her determination was now shared by millions. By whatever means it took, for her children, for herself, for her people, she wanted only one thing: deliverance. And deliverance came. In April 1865, Mary Walker's children were found in Raleigh by a high-ranking Northern general of the victorious Union Army. Happened to be a man named O. Howard, who later went on to head up the Freedmen's Bureau. He knew their story, and he knew hers. And he found and told her daughter and son, who were now grown, their mother was alive and well in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and wanted them to join her. And that summer, they did. And now you can turn to the back page. That summer, they did. And 5 years later, with the help of the Leslie relatives, Mary Walker bought a dwelling that had once belonged to the village blacksmith of Cambridge. The village blacksmith immortalized in poetry by his neighbor Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Under a spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith, a mighty man is he, with large and sinewy hands. I stopped there, but when I gave this version of this talk in New England, people just went on and on and on. They memorized this. And Mary Walker's descendants lived in the village blacksmith's house, now a Cambridge historic site and adult education center, from 1870 to 1912. Longer than the village blacksmith, longer than any other occupant of that house. And there her children and their spouses spent the rest of their days. And there her grandchildren grew to adulthood. And thanks to Mary Walker and her friends and the house she acquired, her descendants had far greater choices than she had ever known. So it's an astonishing odyssey, all there in her story. The price of freedom, a secret striving to recover a family, a journey from the Cameron plantation to the village blacksmith's house. On an intimate human scale, this hidden epic of family love, emancipation, and the entire Civil War era flows through the lives of Mary Walker, her friends, and their households. And now into the lives, if you look at the images, of her Irish Catholic descendants, who early in the 21st century learned of their enslaved forebear and have embraced Mary Walker wholeheartedly. So today, Mary Walker's story comes back to North Carolina, where it began, and to St. Matthew's, where her former owners and their descendants worshiped and have been laid to rest. Were they here today, I hope and think, they too would embrace Mary Walker's story and affirm that her deliverance and the deliverance of her children and deliverance of her people became their deliverance as well. Thank you. Quite a few friends and former students here, and I told Mary Rocapo, who occasionally has been to a black church, but Judith and I have been often, and we know that when a visiting minister comes to a black church, he always brings people from his congregation to be with him. And those folks are called his Amen Corner. So when he asks, can I get a witness, at least those folks will bear witness there. So I thank my friends and former students especially for being the Amen Corner today. So I'm happy to happy to answer questions, get comments, and my wife Judith, who is my eyes when I drive and my ears when I give a talk like this, will help me understand in case I don't get it right away. If you have any thoughts. Florence.
In your research, did you ever encounter any overt resistance to what you were trying to do?
So the short answer, the question is, did I ever encounter any overt resistance to what I was trying to do for this book? And I can answer that in two ways. First, when I gave a talk about Mary Walker in Raleigh, a woman came up to me afterwards. She may be here again, for all I know. And she said, well, why did Mary Walker escape in Philadelphia? Why did she take that threat seriously? And I was a little surprised at the question, but I thought, Duncan Cameron rarely made a threat that he didn't carry through. And that was my answer. Only later did I find that she was a descendant of the Camerons, okay? But so, it was a perfectly legitimate question. So it wasn't resistance, it was just unexpected. But the other answer is about inner resistance. So when I traced out Mary Walker's descendants, I knew she had family in Cambridge. And then when her house was sold, the proceeds went to her grandson, who bought a house just a couple of blocks away. And then when his house was sold, his proceeds went to his nephew, who lived in Glastonbury, Connecticut. So I went to Glastonbury, Connecticut, and found where that money had gone. It was, this is an amazing story, really, if you're interested in the whole question of reparations. What difference does it make to have an endowment or have an equity in a house? And you could just see it from deed to deed. Deed records are the best kept records in America, okay? So I found out that this was the residence of a woman named Donna Erb. I didn't quite know how to pronounce her name, but I knew that. And I went up to the doorbell. And we got that close to the doorbell, and I thought, exactly what am I going to say to this person? Pulled back, went home to Durham, where we were living. And then I told this story to a class of adult learners. And happily, Robin Miller, who's here today, said to me, I think we need to talk. And we had coffee, lunch, and she said, let me tell you a story. I was reared here in North Carolina, and all of a sudden, my parents, if I garble this, I'll get it close. My parents pulled me out of school for a week, and she asked why, and she said, well, there was a Klan rally up the road. Well, why should I be pulled out of school for a Klan rally? And that's when Robin found out that she'd been adopted, and that her parents were Jewish. And that's why they pulled her away, because the Klan is interested in hostile to Jews as well as. And Robin said, and I wanted to know. I wanted to know about my heritage. I wanted to know about my parents, and they might want to know too. So I sucked it up, and I wrote a letter to Donna Erb, very cagey letter, and we met up in Glastonbury, Connecticut, and she brought Claire, her aunt, who's the elder in this picture that you have, and as I began to break the news to them, this was just fine with them, and they were happy to learn about this forebear. I did learn subsequently, Robin, that there had been a telephone tree established to pass on to relatives what this Duke professor was going to bring them about their forebears. And one person called the other and said, sit down, we're black. So the resistance was in me there. A little gun shy about how to do this and how it would go down. But it went down wonderfully well. And actually, Alan O'Shaughnessy, who is a descendant of Mary Walker, is actually here with us today. Yes.
You mentioned that she was very light-skinned, and I wondered what is known about her white ancestry and what relationships might have been there, because it must have been complicated.
Well, I know nothing about that. I've never been able to trace out the background of the Walker name. The best guess I could make was that if it wasn't a member of the Cameron family, that it might have been a doctor who saw a lot of her mother. Her mother was ill all the time. But I really don't know about her white forebears, or that of her mother, or that of her grandmother, for that matter. She's third generation with white forebears in the genealogy there. So I don't know the answer to that. Yes.
Just to follow on to that, I assume this is so that there are no images we have of Mary Walker.
Nope, I have none of Mary Walker. I was very lucky to get the images I did get from the Leslie family, and then to get to know the family, the descendants of Mary Walker. I do know that when she was described by the friend I told you about, who talked about the quarrel and the threat, that she was described by several people as a woman who was very, very light-skinned, almost white, eyes tending to blue or gray, long, straight black hair. There was emphasis on the hair. So that's about as much as I know. I also know that she didn't have her forefront teeth, and I really couldn't get that whole idea of how she would be brought to Philadelphia and allowed to walk around without some kind of care. But I do know one of the anti-slavery leaders of Philadelphia, black anti-slavery leaders, was a dentist, and she got those teeth right away as soon as she was free. So there was immediate bonus for freedom, actually, there. Yes?
Did the Wesley family help any others? Did the Wesley family help any others?
So what's the question?
Did the Wesley family help any others besides Mary?
The question is, did the Leslie family help any other enslaved people besides Mary? They got to know other people through Mary. There are other people who were fugitives from slavery. So they didn't actually help any other people. You know, Peter Leslie saved up money. Mary Walker saved up $500 as a seamstress. She was a dressmaker, a wonderful dressmaker. By the way, her daughter and granddaughter became dressmakers. That was her mother. But she saved up $500, and Peter Leslie was going to spend all his savings to ransom her out if he got a positive response from Mildred Buchanan. So they were, they weren't well-to-do people, but that was their way of being destiny. But they also got to know a lot of the fugitives, as they were called, in Boston. Yes, sir.
Who is the letter written by?
The letter was written by J.T. Leslie,
Okay.
who is the man pictured in that daguerreotype. J.T. Leslie. He just identified himself as a professor of mine, but that was, he was a lot more than that. He actually became the secretary for the University Philosophical Society, and some of the papers are there too. Yes.
The letter was so compelling and addressed to Mildred Cameron, and Mary Walker had nursed her sisters through their deaths of tuberculosis, and one of the daughters wanted Mary to receive her freedom. Do you think Mildred ever got that letter, or do you think it was intercepted by her?
Okay, so the question is, did Mildred get the letter? And if Mildred,
I think you probably heard that earlier.
the question is, did Mildred get this letter? And if she got it, why didn't she act on it? And so Mildred was an invalid. Mildred was the youngest of the sisters. There was an older sister, Margaret, who was strong. And then 4 sisters who died of tuberculosis within a 2-year period, 1838 to 1840. And then Mildred's mother, Rebecca Cameron, died. And we don't know what happened to Mildred, but all of a sudden she gets spasms, and then she can't walk, and it's clearly psychosomatic as well as whatever else was going on. So in a sense, she's now being cared for and taken care of. And she gets a lot of justified sympathy for her condition, but she's not in really any position to do much. I think if it had been up to her alone and her sister Margaret, that they might have done something. But in the meantime, Margaret Cameron, the older sister, had married someone that Paul Cameron who was by then the patriarch of the family, despised. And so you get this crossfire. If Martin wants to do something, then these two men who really despise each other have to agree on this. And I think that meant probably that and the letter winds up in Paul Cameron's papers. So I think for family comity, they just turned the letter over to him and figured, okay, that had to be the end of it. They were really paralyzed physically and emotionally from doing anything about it. That's my take on it. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think it was Paul Cameron's pride that wouldn't let him just accept the money for her family to leave?
Do I think it was Paul Cameron's pride that would keep him from
Accepting the money for, when they wanted to buy the rest of the family?
Yes. It was more than that, because Mary Walker wasn't the only one who escaped. Mary Walker's son escaped. And Frank, he was the oldest son. And he escaped after she did it. And one of the things that happened, I said there were no reprisals. Well, that's not quite true. The mother didn't feel the reprisals, and I think the daughter, Mary Walker's daughter, didn't. But they began to harass him, I think. And he thought, I've got to get out of here. And he was even more light-skinned than she was. And he gets to Trenton, New Jersey. He writes back, actually. The letter is intercepted by the postmaster. The postmaster sends it on to the family. And Paul said, send somebody up to try to capture him, which was exactly what Susan Leslie feared would happen if a letter came. The minute that letter comes, he's not, and it's pride, but it's also, I got to show them. You can't get away with this there. So he was in that frame of mind when that letter came. So he was in no frame of mind to help out somebody who had escaped slavery. He was in a frame of mind to teach everybody a lesson that you can't do this. And if he's very explicit, when I recapture him, I'm going to sell him. Okay? And the Camerons were not people who sold enslaved people. There was a kind of unspoken pact that was violated ultimately, but an unspoken pact that was captured in the phrase of a descendant who was interviewed later. They stole your labor, but they kept you together. So that was the trade-off there. But this just raised his hackles, and he was not going to do that. Yes, sir.
I remember you mentioned about the names, about how some of the slaves used the names to continue on with the legacy within the family. That put in place of how my grandfather, great-grandfather, the chain, because my great-great-great-grandfather, Ephraim Hart, that came out of New York and came here, got sold in Petersburg, and it's a long, detailed story, but what he did was he made his first son promise that every firstborn son would be named Ephraim. Go down the chain, every firstborn son is named Ephraim. So it makes it a little...
And Herbert Gutman would love you. And that's the point, and if you're Ricky Hart, then you can go back and begin to find out about the Ephraims, and it's really good for genealogical research, but also for connecting up with your forebears there. So I think that was the real gift that Gutman had, with using these plantation registers and finding that there's clusters in family groups, and then you can see the renaming there. Well, thank you very much. Wonderful to see you all.